Hey folks, Gene Tiberio here, and you've just tuned in to Healing Outside the Box. Since today is episode 250, and it's a nice round number, I thought I would take a day off from my nutrition episodes and give you a storytelling episode. I've got a couple of stories here. The first is called The Grand Betrayal, and it's rather long, about 20 minutes. And the second is called My Glass Half Empty, Just Turned Upside Down. Enjoy. The Grand Betrayal. This story has a little bit of everything. It's about relationships, in this case, between a disabled woman, moi, and her personal care attendant. By the way, if you hear an occasional pop in the background, that's my cat Betty popping the bubble wrap from a package I just got. So this story is about me and my personal care attendants, and it's about domestic violence, courtroom drama, drug abuse, laughter, tears, lust, not between me and her, although there's nothing wrong with that. It's also about betrayal, bank embezzlement, and the loss of a child. But mostly it's about helping each other being the right thing to do, regardless of the outcome. A few days ago, I was listening to a Netflix series called You, or You. This guy that lives in a New York apartment building intervened to help a woman and her child who were both being tortured by an abusive boyfriend. It did not end well. Weirdly enough, that night I had a dream about Amy, an old personal care attendant of mine from 7 years ago. Amy appeared on my doorstep because of a recommendation from another PCA who was Amy's friend. I liked and trusted the woman referring her to me, so I hired her. Amy was funny, upbeat, talkative, interesting. She seldom had a bad word to say about anyone. It was altogether too perfect. Amy worked both day and evening shifts, but it was during the evening shifts when we had the best conversations. Regardless of the topic, I was interested in her stories and her opinions. We talked about psychology, and more specifically, the complexity of human behavior. And we'll get back to that. We also talked about wine and the good life. Amy spun stories about where she had tasted a specific wine and details about each one. All of the wines were new to me. These wines went hand in hand with the finest of stories. I told her about a time back in 1979 when I was living in Ithaca, New York, near the wine country. I sampled a glass of wine called Johannesburg Riesling from a small vineyard where the grapes were picked by hand. It was $14 a bottle at the time, which was an extravagance for a poor student, but definitely worth the memory of its taste. The memory of tasting that wine for the first time would become my go-to argument for quality over quantity. We both dreamed of someday having a collection of fine wines. Good would not be good enough. I loved to draw from her cleverness, and I envied the ease with which she spun those stories. We were different in many ways. She was the dancer on those imaginary tables at parties. I was the wallflower. She lived in the present moment. I was a planner who couldn't let go of the past and couldn't get out of my own head. In school, sometimes I couldn't sleep until my projects were put to bed. One year we went to the 4th of July fireworks together. Her son was an adorable 2-year-old curly-haired boy who was smiling all the time. Amy loved the noise in the crowds at the 4th of July. I loved the fact that the fireworks were only a block from my house. But we were both pals and it worked. Later in the summer, Amy was scheduled to work the overnight shift when she called around 8 p.m. She was crying. Speaking in halting sentences and sobbing, she said that something terrible had happened and that she couldn't come to work. She and her husband had a fight. In the background, I could hear him screaming obscenities at her, along with loud, unrecognizable noises. I asked her if she wanted me to call the police, and she said, No, don't do that. During the next 2 hours, I got 4 more calls from her during what was clearly a domestic violence episode. In one of the following conversations, I asked, "Do you want me to call 911 for you?" At that time, she said, No, I'm outside now. He pushed me out the door and down the stairs. He's got my son. He said he'll kill my son if he sees the blue lights of the police cars. Where are you now? I said. I'm walking to the police station, she said. The station was about 1.5 miles from where she lived. I stayed on the phone with her until she got to the police station. During one of these calls, she said, my husband held a knife up to my throat and said, this is going to end right now. I didn't know this at the time, but he also said that he would slit the throat of their 3-year-old son in front of her. At the police station, Amy called me up again. After speaking with the police, she was even more hysterical. I'm guessing that, given the fact that she said her husband had a knife and a child, the police had hit the so-called red button, and it all became very real to her. 4 police officers went after the husband, who was apparently still holding the boy and the knife. When the cops pounded on the door, her husband said, I hope you brought your sleeping bags, because you're going to be there a long time. 4 cops then broke down the door, got the boy, and wrestled Amy's husband to the ground. I found out, because I read it in the paper, that her husband had used the 3-year-old boy as a human shield. Not surprisingly, he took a beating when he was arrested. In our last conversation that night, I expected her to thank me for helping get her boy to safety, but I heard another conversation altogether. Amy told me in great detail that they were fighting over the fact that I, and that would be Jean the disabled woman, was making her go to work when it was her husband's birthday the next day. He wanted to have sex with her, and I was depriving him of that. She was furious with me and later denied that we ever talked on the phone. We, in fact, had 5 separate conversations. When I heard this, I was still obviously traumatized, and it was like someone had sucker punched me. The incident had become my fault. I said to her, I never forced you to go to work. I didn't know that all of this was happening. I told you it would be okay for you not to go to work, in fact. Which is what happened. I got a replacement PCA when I knew that she was in trouble. At this point, I've not yet learned that this is a typical scenario for domestic violence. When someone intervenes to help the mother and child, it seldom goes well. I found out from the police that Amy had told the police I was scolding her and telling her that she had to come to work on her husband's birthday. I don't think she told the police about the sex. When she relayed the story to me, it became even more elaborate. The next day, Amy called me to tell me that everything was fine and that there was no need to talk to the police. But she was a little late because the police had already called me, and I mentioned that Amy already called 5 times last night. It was their turn to be surprised. The next week, Amy told the grand jury, under oath, that I was the one that started the fight because I told her that she had to come to work, and it was her husband's birthday the next day. She added to the grand jury that her husband was an awesome dad and that he just wanted to celebrate his birthday with her. She then told the grand jury that I was lying about the 5 phone calls. The district attorney wasn't buying any of this and told Amy that they would take custody of the boy if she did not at least cooperate with the attempted murder charge against the boy. She reluctantly allowed the DA to press charges, but she told the DA that she was never going to testify against her husband. The DA was not optimistic that they could get a conviction without the testimony of the wife, but at least they had the witness, and that would be me. Enter disabled woman, stage right. The incident made the front page of the local newspaper. Although Salem, Massachusetts is famous for the witchcraft hysteria in 1692, it's actually a small town in many ways. Ironically, Amy lived on Gallows Hill in Salem, and her address was of course recorded in the newspaper. She even engaged with the trollers on the internet, who were commenting and telling each other what a terrible mother she was. Then I got a call from her husband's lawyer. He was overly friendly, of course, and was asking me if I could remember what went on during the 5 conversations. I remember it all too well, of course. I had written it down, but I wasn't going to tell him. I was a little OCD about writing it all down, because, of course, that's my coping mechanism, and that's who I am. And I suspected she'd spend the next 2 weeks trying to change my story, which she did, of course. Later that week, I had a nightmare that went something like this. I was heading into the driveway of my parents' house when I spotted something in their backyard swimming pool. They don't have a pool, but that's okay. As I approached, and yes, I was walking, I saw a body lying face down across the in-ground swimming pool, outlined in brick red blood against the otherwise clear water. I needed to talk to someone about this nightmare, but the one person that I would have approached, because she was traumatized as well, was Amy. And Amy had chosen to deny that it happened. A few weeks later, Amy's husband was handed an indictment for domestic violence against a minor. This is where I found out the details that he had held a knife to the boy's throat as well. That day, Amy left an angry voicemail on my answering machine, saying that she was quitting and never wanted to see or speak to me again. Oddly enough, she changed her mind and worked for me for the next several months, but the closeness was gone. When Amy finally gave me her 2 weeks' notice in December of 2011, I was hurt but not surprised. If I think about it, my relationship with any personal care attendant is a unique one. A personal care attendant is paid to come to my house and take care of me. They need to feed me, answer to my constant commands, and take off my clothes and bathe me after just meeting me. It's like being taken care of in a hospital by a nurse, with this one distinction. Although I'd like to believe very often that this person is a dear friend or family member, these relationships almost always come to an abrupt end. Enter Doug. Before I tell you about Doug and Amy's relationship, I should probably introduce you to Doug. He answered an ad that I put out in the Help Wanted section of a local newspaper. At first I was not going to hire him simply because he was a guy, but he persisted and had experience as a PCA, so I hired him. I also assumed he was gay, but my gaydar must not have been working that day. Because another PCA had left without notice, and the others were unable to fill in, I felt I had little choice in the matter. One thing was for certain, there was no such thing as a neutral reaction to this man. On his best days, he was whimsical and hilariously quirky. He sometimes showed up for work in what could only be described as a costume. One day he arrived wearing a knee-length lab coat and a fake stethoscope sticking out of his pocket. A nose ring and a toothbrush in his ear completed the ensemble. Another night he might arrive dressed as either a pirate or a hobo, with a pink milkshake of some kind spilling out of one hand. He made me laugh, even on my worst days. After he put me to bed one night, I was lying on my side with the dim light of my energy saver lamp lighting up on the wall in front of me. Doug noticed the shadows on the wall. It immediately occurred to him that shadow puppets were in order. He skillfully made me a barking dog, a chicken, and a bunny rabbit. The shadow puppets were, of course, accompanied by noises appropriate to the various animals. It occurred to me to ask him, who does this for anyone over the age of 6? Clearly at least one PCA did, and it was funny. At other times he would sing and dance. He got away with all of this because he made me laugh, and it was worth the cost of the craziness. And yes, I was aware that he more than likely used his fair share of recreational drugs. One night he came in almost an hour late, looking filthy and overtired. He spent the weekend at a Woodstock-type outdoor concert, where his rock band, yes, he was in a rock band, was playing, and he felt the need to go. By his own admission, the concert was poorly attended, and perhaps more of an excuse to do drugs out in the open. He admitted that he had been drinking and did some mushrooms. Since it was too late to get a replacement, I simply told him to get into the shower before he came anywhere near me. There was no doubt in my mind that he was a bit of a phony, but he had a way of making you feel like you were the most important person to him, at least in that moment. At the time, I sometimes felt like I was fighting my battles as a solitary warrior. And there's plenty of battles because I am so weak that I cannot lift my arm up off of my armrest. I therefore chose to ignore my better judgment and believe that the part of him that made you feel special was sincere. It was not. Doug meet Amy. Amy and Doug first crossed paths when Amy was training with another woman on the day shift early in 2011. Doug had been working the previous evening's night shift. At about 10:30 a.m., we were in the living room discussing various job duties with Amy. The TV was just background noise. Suddenly, the background noise became an a cappella group of high school students singing California Dreamin' by the Mamas and the Papas. The background noise moved to the forefront in my brain as the two-part harmony filled my head. Within 30 seconds, I heard the rhythmic thud of Doug in his bare feet, stumbling down the hallway toward us. A disheveled, bed-headed man appeared, wearing boxer shorts and rubbing his eyes. Amy turned to me and I got the look. Now, I've seen this look many times, and I was ready with a snappy response. "I don't know where he came from," I muttered. Then I turned to listen to the song again. Then it was Doug's turn to mutter, "They're singing a song." California Dreamin' was indeed the song we sang on many occasions. The song is sung in two parts. On one occasion, I would sing the initial part. On another, I would sing the backup part. Sometimes I would wail out words like Janis Joplin. He might hold an imaginary microphone. It was slightly different each time. Amy respectfully waited until the a cappella group finished singing the song. They sang a lovely version of it. Many voices in pitch-perfect harmony. Amy then turned to Doug, anxiously waiting for her introduction. I don't know if there was an immediate attraction in either direction, but after a few more interactions, I knew that she was smitten. Doug was a player, so the deal was sealed. One day they crossed paths in the hallway, and Doug lightly stroked her arm, where she was adorned with a large tattoo of some kind. It may have had something to do with Vikings, since Amy was Irish Catholic like me. She had that "I think he likes me" expression on her face. The one thing I knew for sure was that this was going to end badly. But I had no idea what this was going to be. Amy was married with a small child. Doug, on the other hand, fell in love about every other week. His one-night stands with his lover's best friend usually ended his current relationship. Amy was going to be the next love affair. Once Amy was smitten, she looked for his phone number on the refrigerator. Doug was a little like Jude Law's character in the movie The Talented Mr. Ripley. Doug made people feel like they were special. Even though women knew that it was an act, they couldn't keep that first foot out of the quicksand. It was silly of me to think that this intelligent and clever woman could not find a way to contact Doug. Doug was a player, and he knew the game. He told every woman he met that he was in a rock and roll band. But truthfully, he seldom showed up for practice and was eventually kicked out of the band. After her anger with me for what I did during the domestic violence incident, I suspected that she would plot with Doug to do something to hurt me. And she did. I also suspected that I would miss the attention that he would no longer give to me, and I did. Instead of telling funny stories and engaging in conversations, Doug would roll his eyes and be annoyed with me for wanting to engage in amusing conversation, or even singing a song. He left the room as soon as he was finished helping me. They were both seeing each other in secret for months. Doug never said anything to suggest the affair was going on. Amy, on the other hand, occasionally would let something slip like, "These rings on the coffee table, do these rings belong to Doug?" "I don't know," I said, and dropped the subject. That was the first time in a while that she wanted to engage in conversation, and I didn't play along. She was also giving me the cold shoulder. One night I told Doug that Amy went back to her husband in the summer right after the knife incident. Doug opened his eyes wide and his mouth fell open. "What knife incident?" he asked. And I said, "Amy's husband held a knife to her son's throat and threatened to slit the boy's throat open." The stunned expression on his face told me that this was news to him. Doug was homeless at the time, bouncing from couch to couch. But suddenly he stopped talking about being homeless. Amy had kicked her husband out, then later brought him back in. And Doug moved into her Section 8 apartment on Gallows Hill. In early November, Doug suddenly mentioned that he was planning to take a long vacation to California. Around the same time, Amy started talking about buying a house. Amy stopped talking about her husband abruptly. The plans they were both making sounded a little like they had come into some money. Doug no-showed twice for his shift. He then showed up an hour late, clearly high on what appeared to be heroin. It was in fact heroin, as I later discovered. I called him up the next morning and fired him. Just before that, Amy said, "You should definitely fire Doug right away." She kept repeating it, talking faster and faster, in a high-pitched, anxious voice. Then, in a very purposeful tone of voice, Amy asked me if she could use my copy machine. She claimed that it was papers related to her second job as a bank teller down at the Citizens Bank in Vinton Square, about 3 miles from here. I assured her that it was fine and went to bed. The next morning, another of my PCAs looked at my copy machine and asked me what I wanted to do with this copy of something. Well, it was certainly something. It was a copy of a check seemingly issued by the Kissimmee Corporation and addressed to Doug. The payer was a man's name I didn't recognize, but the handwriting was clearly Amy's, and the check was for $3,956. I found out later that there were other checks totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars. I wondered who on earth would have cashed this obviously fake check. Then I realized that Amy was more than likely the bank teller who cashed it. The two of them were embezzling large amounts of money and using my computer and my copy machine. Their plan was to accuse me of the embezzlement if they got caught. Totally freaking out, I immediately checked my Google searches, and sure enough, the Kissimmee Corporation came up as a recent search on my laptop, even though I didn't know it had existed. I'd never heard of this corporation, but clearly Doug had, and thought it was an amusing name. Just below that search on Google, there was another search for flame-eating materials. I happened to know that Doug was into flame swallowing and performed it for his friends. Of course he did. So Doug had hacked into my computer. They had intentionally put proof of their crime on my laptop to implicate me. I panicked and called my sister. We decided that because they used my computer and copy machine, I would be accused of conspiring with them. That was the point. If they were going to go down, they would frame me. So I called the police, and an officer came to the house. This officer just happened to be the father of another one of my PCAs, who worked another overnight shift. This 6 degrees of separation nonsense was a recurring theme with my PCAs. The officer looked at my computer, took the only copy of the fake check, and never contacted me again. I learned later that they had a conversation with Citizens Bank and brought in a couple of investigators. Citizens Bank told the police to stop the investigation and destroy the copy of that check. Since they were the victim, they could choose to do that. I could only guess that perhaps it was more important to the bank to be able to keep Amy's involvement quiet as she was their bank teller. And around that time, as I recall, Citizens Bank had started a new policy to charge a monthly fee for a checking account. Things might look fishy if that story made the front page of the newspaper. Doug then disappeared to New York and was never charged. Amy was also never charged, but later lost custody of her son when her abusive husband moved back in and was violent towards the boy. As for the Doug and Amy story, I realize now that I had a part to play in all of this. I tried to paint too many colors on top of each other and ended up with a palette that was muddy brown. So the way I see it now, all of the laughter, the fine wines, the shadow puppets, and the grand betrayal were all jumbled up with no defining boundaries. I could have used a wall. My glass half empty, just turned upside down, a disabled woman's perspective. In last week's episode, I talked about how I was diagnosed with muscular dystrophy in 1982 and then re-diagnosed last year in 2016 with hereditary inclusion body myopathy, or HIBM. It still falls under the umbrella of a muscular dystrophy type of myopathy, but it is unique because we know the defective gene in the protein that this defective gene makes, or in my case, doesn't make or makes poorly. I then entered an NIH clinical study this past January of 2017 for a possible drug that would treat my disease. It was not a double-blind study, so everyone in the study would be getting the drug. I was so excited in January when I entered the clinical research study. Then I was so devastated last April 7th when I was booted from the study because I was having trouble swallowing the huge pills. I should back up and mention that when I entered the study last January, I was essentially a complete quadriplegic. I could not wiggle my toes or lift my legs. I could not lift my hands or arms. I could wiggle 2 or 3 fingers on each hand and move my head from side to side a bit. My swallowing and digestion were both fine, but my breathing was getting worse, and I needed a nighttime respirator to sufficiently breathe while sleeping. I've been on this respirator for a while, but the backup oxygen that I needed was something new last year. So this was my big chance. 35 years of hoping for a treatment was going to be thankfully behind me. When I arrived at the New York University, or NYU clinic, on the 20th floor, I was given a starting gate assessment of my strength. They had all kinds of machines. I was asked to squeeze, I was asked to pull, maybe push. Even though I thought I did a great job, I'm not sure how impressed they were. But when I came back on April 7th, 3 months later, I knew that they would find that my strength improved, both in my hands and arms. So I pushed and pulled again, and I found out later that I had indeed increased my strength. And then I opened my big fat mouth and told them that I was having trouble swallowing what can only be referred to as horse pills. Although I'm not sure that those magnificent muscular creatures would have had an easier time swallowing these. At the end of the visit, they all went into another room to, I guess, discuss things. Then the neurologist walked into my room, sat down, not a very happy look on her face, and said that they had to boot me from the study because of a risk of choking. Then it was my turn not to be happy. As I mentioned in a previous episode, I was crying for about the first hour of my trip home from New York City to Salem, Massachusetts. Then I stopped crying finally, and I started feeling sorry for myself. Then I started ranting and I sensed a hint of sarcasm in my rants, which is my unique brand of being angry at the world. No one in particular, just the whole world. Over the next several months, I managed to tread water and tried to make some kind of lemonade out of the lemons that had been handed to me, but with varying success. So here we are at the end of December, the time of year when we all drum up the courage to make New Year's resolutions. This is what I'm going to do next Monday. Now, I already know how I feel about New Year's resolutions, i.e., that they don't work. But this year, I just can't help myself. So for my New Year's resolution, I decided to attempt to be a glass half full person. Now, I just did something that I thought I'd never do. I looked up the Wikipedia definition of optimism. Here's what they say. Optimism is a mental attitude reflecting a belief or hope that the outcome of some specific endeavor, or outcomes in general, will be positive, favorable, and desirable. The term derives from the Latin optimum, meaning best. Being optimistic, in the typical sense of the word, is defined as expecting the best possible outcome from any given situation. So that was Wikipedia. Now, I also found a quote from Winston Churchill on this subject, and I love quoting Winston Churchill. By the way, I'm learning from watching Peaky Blinders on Netflix that Winston Churchill was quite the thug in his early days. But I have to say that the guy could certainly spin a phrase. Anyway, here's his quote. A pessimist sees the difficulty in every opportunity. An optimist sees the opportunity in every difficulty. Well said, old boy. Perhaps if I were living in one of many other countries, I wouldn't be alive right now because it literally takes a village, and a home respirator, and the best skincare treatment for an open pressure sore, and modern emergency room care for a bout of pneumonia, which fortunately only happened once. And if I weren't alive, I couldn't be working on, say, SNAP benefits policy, or working on educational nutrition videos, or school garden projects in Salem, and hopefully elsewhere, or putting out this podcast every week, or making pad thai and shrimp marinara for my parents, and last but not least, occasionally making my family laugh with my sarcastic dry wit. So I'm glad I forced myself to write this episode and talk about my personal life, because now I hear myself say that we can all touch each other's lives in a positive way if we choose to do so. As I sometimes like to say, and on January 1st, or often like to say, we are all one, with a capital O. And if we can all get out of our own heads and have compassion for one another, both here and around the world, maybe it gets easier to see the best that life has to offer. Let's hope so. That's all I have for you today. Be well and stay tuned next week for another episode of Healing Outside the Box.